The thunderstorm had come out of nowhere, turning what should have been a routine red-eye flight from Chicago to Denver into a nightmare at 35,000 feet. Lightning illuminated the cabin in stark, terrifying flashes as Flight 447 bucked and rolled through the turbulence like a leaf caught in a hurricane. Dr. Amara Johnson gripped her armrest, her knuckles white against her dark skin. She'd flown this route dozens of times for her work as an aerospace engineer, but she'd never experienced anything like this. Around her, passengers were crying and praying, their faces pale with terror in the emergency lighting that had kicked in when the main cabin lights failed. 20 minutes earlier, she had tried to approach the cockpit. Something about the way the plane was handling the storm felt wrong to her trained eye. The pitch angles were too aggressive, the banking too sharp. As someone who had spent 15 years designing flight control systems for Boeing, she knew aircraft behavior better than most pilots. But when she'd politely asked the flight attendant if she could speak with the captain, she was met with a dismissive wave. "Mum, please return to your seat. The pilots are handling everything," the attendant had said, barely looking at her. Amara had pressed further, explaining her credentials, but the attendant's expression had grown cold. "I'm sure you think you know about planes, but you need to let the professionals do their job." The dismissal stung, but it wasn't unfamiliar. Throughout her career, Amara had faced countless moments where her expertise was questioned or ignored. In boardrooms, on factory floors, even at industry conferences, she often found herself having to prove her worth twice as hard as her white male colleagues. She'd learned to pick her battles, but something deep in her gut told her this wasn't a battle she could afford to lose. Now, as the plane shuddered violently and oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling, that gut feeling had transformed into cold certainty. Through her window, she could see ice forming on the wings, a dangerous sign that suggested the pilots might not have activated the de-icing systems properly. Worse, the plane's movements indicated they were likely experiencing a stall condition, something that could prove fatal if not corrected immediately. The intercom crackled to life, and she heard the strain in the pilot's voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some technical difficulties. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened." Technical difficulties. Amara's blood ran cold. She recognized the euphemism pilots used when they didn't want to panic passengers. But as an engineer, she could read the signs. The plane was in serious trouble. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up. Her decision made, the flight attendant who had dismissed her earlier was struggling to help passengers with their oxygen masks, her own face pale with fear. "I need to get to the cockpit," Amara said firmly. "Mum, I told you." "Listen to me," Amara interrupted, her voice cutting through the chaos. "My name is Dr. Amara Johnson. I'm a senior aerospace engineer with Boeing. I've designed the flight control systems for the 737 MAX, and I can tell you right now that this aircraft is in a deep stall if the pilots don't correct it. In the next few minutes, we're all going to die." The attendant stared at her, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. Another violent shake of the aircraft sent passengers screaming, and Amara could hear someone being sick in the back. "The plane is icing up," Amara continued, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. "Look at the wings. The pilots need to drop altitude immediately and activate emergency de-icing protocols. I can help them." Before the attendant could respond, a voice came from behind them. "Let her through." It was an elderly man in a pilot's uniform, a passenger, but clearly someone with aviation experience. "I'm Captain Reynolds, retired Air Force. I've been watching this lady, and she knows what she's talking about. We need all the help we can get." The flight attendant looked between them, then at the terrified passengers around her. Another massive jolt made the decision for her. "Follow me," she said, heading toward the cockpit. The cockpit door was locked, protocol during emergencies, but the attendant used her override key. Inside, Amara found a scene of barely controlled panic. The captain, a man in his 50s with graying hair, was wrestling with the controls while his co-pilot frantically worked through emergency checklists. Alarms were blaring, and the instrument panel was lit up like a Christmas tree with warning lights. "Who the hell?" the captain started angrily. "Captain, I'm Dr. Amara Johnson. Aerospace engineer with Boeing, she said quickly. You're in a deep stall, and your airspeed indicators are giving you false readings because of ice buildup. You need to push the nose down and increase power, not pull back. The captain's face flushed red. Lady, I don't know who you think you are, but I've been flying for 23 years. Get out of my cockpit, sir. With respect, you're about to kill everyone on this plane. Amara said, moving closer to the instruments. Her trained eye quickly assessed the situation. It was worse than she'd thought. Your pitot tubes are iced over, your angle of attack is critically high, and you're pulling back on the stick when you should be pushing forward. This is exactly what happened to Air France for 147. The mention of that notorious crash gave the co-pilot pause. Captain, he said hesitantly, maybe we should listen. I said get her out. The captain shouted. At that moment, the plane dropped like a stone, plummeting nearly 1,000 feet before the captain could regain some semblance of control. The violent drop sent Amara crashing into the bulkhead, but she pulled herself back to her feet, adrenaline coursing through her veins. Captain Morrison, she said, reading his name tag, I know you don't want to listen to me. I know that every instinct you have is telling you to pull back on that stick, because it feels like the plane is falling, but that's exactly what's killing you. The ice on your pitot tubes is giving you false airspeed readings. Your plane isn't moving too fast, it's moving too slow. You're in a stall, and the only way out is to point the nose down and add power. The co-pilot was looking at the instruments with new understanding. Captain, she might be right. Look at our actual ground speed versus indicated airspeed. There's a huge discrepancy. Captain Morrison's hands were shaking on the controls. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cold. I don't. Another sickening drop. This time Amara could hear metal groaning under stress. They were running out of time. Captain, please, she said, her voice gentler now. I've spent my entire career studying these systems. I know it goes against every instinct, but you have to trust the physics. Lower the nose, add power, and activate your emergency de-icing. Do it now, or we're all going to die. For a moment that felt like an eternity, the cockpit was silent except for the screaming alarms. Then, slowly, Captain Morrison pushed the stick forward. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The plane's nose dropped, and for a terrifying moment, it felt like they were diving straight toward the earth. But then the airspeed began to increase. The stall warnings stopped, and gradually, the aircraft began to respond to the controls again. Emergency de-icing. Now, Amara called out, and the co-pilot activated the system. Hot air began flowing over the wings and engine inlets, melting away the dangerous ice buildup. Slowly, carefully, Captain Morrison began to level the aircraft. The violent shaking subsided, and the plane settled into stable flight. The silence in the cockpit was deafening after the chaos of the previous minutes. Jesus, the co-pilot whispered. We were really going down. Captain Morrison sat back in his seat, his hands still trembling slightly. He turned to look at Amara, and she saw something she'd rarely seen from a white male pilot: genuine respect and gratitude. Dr. Johnson, he said quietly, I owe you an apology, and more than that, I owe you my life. All of our lives. Amara nodded, her own adrenaline beginning to subside. We all make mistakes. Captain, the important thing is that we learn from this one. The flight attendant who had initially dismissed her appeared in the doorway, tears in her eyes. The passengers want to know what happened. They're calling you a hero. I'm not a hero, Amara said simply. I'm just someone who understood the science. The remainder of the flight to Denver passed without incident. Word of what had happened spread quickly through the cabin, and by the time they landed, Amara found herself surrounded by grateful passengers, many of whom wanted to shake her hand or get her contact information. Several were crying, overwhelmed by how close they'd come to disaster. But it was Captain Morrison's words as they deplaned that would stay with her forever. Dr. Johnson, he said, pulling her aside. I want you to know that I've learned something today that goes way beyond flying. I let my prejudices nearly kill 100 people. That's something I'm going to have to live with. But it's also something I'm going to make sure never happens again. 3 months later, Amara received a call from the Federal Aviation Administration. Captain Morrison had recommended her for a position on their safety advisory board, specifically focusing on human factors in aviation emergencies. Her expertise, he had written in his recommendation,